The American outlaw is one of the most protected myths in popular culture. A man on a horse, outside the law, answering to no one. The word itself, outlaw, carries a promise of autonomy, beyond the system, beyond its reach. The cowboy who robs banks and rides into the sunset has been sold for over a century as the purest image of liberty. The myth survives because it is never examined closely. Most outlaw gangs in the historical American West were not liberation movements. They were parasitic organizations that recruited from poverty, operated through violence, and maintained internal loyalty using the exact same mechanisms found in religious cults and authoritarian cells. A charismatic leader, a shared mythology, an us versus them framework that made the outside world the enemy and the gang the only family. Members did not stay because they were free. They stayed because the structure had made the outside world unthinkable. Arthur Morgan lives inside this structure for over 20 years and never identifies it for what it is. He believes he is a free man riding with free men. He believes in Dutch van der Linde the way a child believes in the ground beneath his feet, not as a choice, but as a condition of existence. He kills for Dutch, steals for Dutch, bleeds for Dutch, and calls it loyalty. And the loyalty feels like something he chose because nobody inside a cult ever experiences the programming as programming. The story of Arthur Morgan is the story of what happens when the programming finally breaks. Arthur's mother died when he was young. His father, Lyle Morgan, was a petty criminal Arthur watched get arrested and eventually die in custody. By the time Arthur was a teenager, he had no family, no structure, no adult who had demonstrated that the world contained anything worth building toward. He was a child alone in a country that had no particular interest in children alone. Dutch van der Linde found him at that exact point. In the psychology of cult recruitment, there is a specific window of vulnerability that predicts lifelong devotion. It is not adulthood, when the mind has already assembled its own framework for understanding the world. It is adolescence, particularly adolescence marked by loss, abandonment, or institutional neglect. A teenager without a stable attachment figure is not just open to a charismatic authority. The teenager is starving for one. The need is biological before it is psychological. The developing brain requires a model of the world, and it will accept the first coherent model offered with an intensity that adult conversion rarely matches. Dutch offered food, shelter, purpose, and something more dangerous than any of those, an ideology. The gang was not a criminal operation. It was, in Dutch's telling, a principled resistance against a corrupt civilization. They robbed the rich because the rich had stolen first. They lived outside the law because the law was a weapon of the powerful. They were the last free men in a country being strangled by industrialization and government overreach. The story was complete, self-reinforcing, and almost impossible to argue with from inside. Hosea Matthews completed the structure. Where Dutch provided the mythology, Hosea provided warmth. He was patient, wry, practical, the gentle counterpart to Dutch's intensity. Together, they formed what anthropology calls fictive kinship, a family bond manufactured from shared experience rather than blood. Arthur did not join a gang. He was adopted into a family that happened to kill people for a living. And because the adoption occurred during the years when his identity was still being assembled, the family became the identity. There was no Arthur Morgan underneath the gang member, because the gang member was the first complete version of Arthur Morgan that ever existed. This is the mechanism that makes everything that follows comprehensible. Arthur's loyalty to Dutch across 2 decades of escalating violence, worsening decisions, and increasingly transparent manipulation is not stupidity. It is structural dependency installed during a critical developmental window. Leaving Dutch would not feel like leaving a boss, or even leaving a father. It would feel like leaving himself, abandoning the only self he had ever been given. The evidence that the cage had a door arrived in 2 forms. One was a woman. The other was a man who used the door and came back. Mary Linton loved Arthur before the story begins and continues to love him across it. She asks him more than once to leave, to walk away from the gang, from Dutch, from the life, to come with her, to build something that belongs to him. Arthur refuses every time. The refusal is typically read as romantic sacrifice, a man who loves a woman but cannot abandon his brothers. The reading is wrong in a way that matters. Arthur does not refuse Mary because he values the gang more than he values her. He refuses because the idea of existing without the gang produces a terror he cannot name and therefore cannot override. It would feel like self-annihilation, stepping off a cliff into a void where no version of Arthur Morgan has ever existed. Mary represents the life Arthur's mind cannot even model. A house, routine, a future built on something other than the next job. He wants it the way a prisoner might want the ocean, as a concept so remote from lived experience that desire and fear become the same sensation. The gang survives for years on a story it tells itself. The people they rob deserve it. The violence serves a cause. The law is the real criminal. Dutch is leading them towards something better. Every functional criminal organization requires this kind of narrative. The human mind is not built to sustain violence without justification. A group of people who kill, steal, and destroy on a regular basis will, without exception, construct a story that reframes the destruction as necessary, noble, or defensive. The cognitive dissonance between "we are good people" and "we burned that family's home" has to be managed, and the management is the ideology. As long as everyone repeats the same story, the story holds. Hosea Matthews was the structural element that kept the story credible. He was the conscience, the moderator, the voice that could translate Dutch's grandiosity into something that resembled principle. When Dutch's plans became reckless, Hosea tempered them. When the violence escalated, Hosea was the presence that allowed the others to believe a line still existed. When Hosea dies in Saint Denis, the architecture collapses. Dutch van der Linde without Hosea is a different organism. The grandiosity that Hosea moderated now operates without a check. The plans become wilder. The paranoia sharpens. The speeches about freedom and civilization grow louder in direct proportion to how badly things are going. What looks from the outside like a descent into madness is better described as a narcissistic collapse. The specific disintegration that occurs when a personality built entirely on a self-image of greatness is confronted with evidence that the greatness was always a performance. Dutch was never leading the gang toward freedom. He was leading them toward a version of the world in which he was the most important figure alive. The cause, the ideology, the speeches about civilization and liberty, all of it was staging. When the world closed in, when the Pinkertons tightened the perimeter and the plans failed and the money vanished and the territory shrank, the staging collapsed, and what remained was a man with no identity outside his own mythology and no mythology left. Micah Bell fills the vacuum that Hosea's death creates. Where Hosea moderated Dutch's worst impulses, Micah accelerates them. He tells Dutch what Dutch needs to hear. He validates the paranoia. He frames every failure as betrayal by the people around Dutch, rather than as evidence of Dutch's own collapse. In the psychology of destructive groups, figures like Micah function as isolating agents. They attach themselves to the leader at the moment of crisis and systematically sever the leader's connections to anyone who might offer a corrective perspective. Micah does not create Dutch's cruelty. He provides the conditions under which it can operate in the open, unashamed, and unchallenged. Arthur watches this happen in real time. The man he built his entire life around is disintegrating, and the disintegration reveals that the man may never have been what Arthur believed. Every justification Arthur used for 20 years of violence depended on Dutch being the person Dutch claimed to be. If Dutch was always performing, If the cause was always a costume worn over naked self-interest, then Arthur has not been a freedom fighter or a loyal son or a principled outlaw. He has been an enforcer for a con man. And the identity he was given at 14 was counterfeit, and every year he lived inside it was a year spent in someone else's lie. There is one object in the game that complicates everything written above. Arthur keeps a journal. He sketches animals, plants, landscapes. He writes about the weather, about people he met on the road, about the way light falls on water at certain times of day. The drawings are skilled and careful and contain an attention to the natural world that belongs to a completely different person than the one holding up stagecoaches. The journal is evidence that the cult programming was never total. Somewhere underneath the enforcer, underneath the loyalty, underneath the 20 years of Dutch's mythology, a separate consciousness was recording the world as it actually looked. Not as a series of targets and threats, but as a place with deer and rivers and weather worth documenting. It narrates the existence of a man who noticed beauty between acts of destruction and did not know what to do with the observation except put it on paper. This matters because it reframes the tuberculosis diagnosis. The disease does not create a new Arthur Morgan. It uncovers one that was already there, writing quietly in the margins of a life spent following orders. The self that the cult could not fully overwrite had been leaving evidence of its existence the entire time, in the pages of a book nobody else was reading. Arthur's journal was proof that there was a man there the system couldn't erase. I want to hear from you. Which other video game character has a human layer as deep and hidden as his? Comment below and help me build the next scripts. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and hit the hype button to strengthen the channel. Now, let's talk about the moment Arthur's time finally began to run out. Arthur contracts tuberculosis from a man named Thomas Downs, a gentle, sick man who coughed blood onto Arthur's face while Arthur was collecting money the man did not have. The disease enters Arthur's body through an act of violence performed in service of the gang, which means the gang is literally killing him. The loyalty that structured his entire life is now the thing filling his lungs with fluid. The diagnosis does what no amount of evidence, no betrayal by Dutch, no argument from Mary Linton could do. It introduces a deadline. The human mind operates under normal conditions on an assumption of indefinite continuity. Moral reckonings can always happen tomorrow. Identity crises can always be resolved next year. The uncomfortable truth sitting at the edge of consciousness can always be examined later, when things settle down, when there is time. This assumption is what allows a person to spend an entire life inside a structure they suspect is wrong, because the confrontation with that wrongness can always be postponed. A terminal diagnosis destroys the assumption. The concept in psychology is mortality salience, the sudden, inescapable awareness that time is finite and actively running out. When mortality becomes salient, the mechanisms that allowed postponement stop functioning. The questions that were always for later become for now, and there is no later to push them into. Arthur begins coughing blood, and the world reorganizes itself around him. Dutch's promises of one more score, one more job, one more plan, promises that sustained the cult's narrative for decades, suddenly sound like what they always were, the stalling tactics of a man who has no destination. The money means nothing to a body that will not be alive to spend it. The cause means nothing to a man who can now see, with terminal clarity, that the cause was never real. The scene at the train station with Sister Calderone is where the architecture of the cowboy persona finally gives way. A nun waiting for a train. Arthur waiting for something he cannot articulate.
What am I gonna do now?
Be grateful that for the first time, you see your life clearly.
Sure.
Perhaps you could help somebody. Helping makes you really happy.
But I still don't believe in nothing.
Often, neither do I.
Huh?
But then I meet someone like you, and everything makes sense.
You're too smart for me, sister. I guess I'm afraid.
There is nothing to be afraid of, Mr. Morgan. Take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act.
The fear is not of death alone. It is of having arrived at the end of a life and recognizing, with full clarity for the first time, that the life was not his. The years belonged to Dutch. The violence belonged to Dutch's mythology. The loyalty was installed, not chosen. And now, there is no time left to build something that actually belongs to Arthur Morgan, because Arthur Morgan is dying inside a body that was used up in service of someone else's fantasy. A man who understands that his own salvation is no longer available has two options. He can die inside the despair, or he can convert the time remaining into something that outlasts him. Arthur chooses the second, and the target is John Marston. For years, John Marston was a walking insult to Arthur's deepest regrets. John possessed the exact salvation Arthur had sacrificed on the altar of Dutch's loyalty. A woman who loved him, a child, a tangible future. And John's response was to abandon it all for a year. Watching a younger man recklessly squander the very life Arthur had violently denied himself wasn't just irresponsible, it was an agonizing mirror. Arthur hated him not because John was a traitor to the gang's code, but because John was blind to his own luck. The contempt from the early chapters is gone by now. The projection has been dismantled, not by therapy or self-reflection, but by the brute force of dying, which strips away the luxury of maintaining comfortable hatreds. Because John's escape is the only thing Arthur can still build with the time his body has left. The concept in theology and moral philosophy is redemption by proxy, the transfer of moral meaning from one person to another through sacrifice. Arthur cannot redeem his own life. What he did is real and extensive and permanent, and belongs to people who are dead because of choices he made, however programmed those choices were. No amount of final act goodness erases Thomas Downs, or the homesteaders, or the dozens of unnamed people who stopped existing so Dutch could fund another plan that led nowhere. Arthur understands this without self-pity. The harm is honest. The harm is forever. What he can do is ensure that John, the man with a wife, a son, a future Arthur could never model for himself, gets free, gets clear of the collapsing structure, takes Abigail and Jack, and builds the life that Arthur turned down when Mary offered it. The final hours of Arthur Morgan's life are spent extracting the Marston family from the wreckage. He fights Pinkertons, diverts pursuit, confronts Dutch, and does all of it while his lungs are actively failing, while every breath is shorter than the one before, and the blood comes more frequently, and his body is informing him, with increasing urgency, that the window for decisions has closed. On the mountain, he tells John to go.
All right, Arthur, come on, let's go.
You go.
John resists.
Keep pushing, Arthur.
No. No. I think I've pushed all I can.
Come on.
You go.
We ain't got time for this, not now.
We ain't both gonna make it. Go. Now. I'll hold them off. It would mean a lot to me. Please. There ain't no more time for talk. Go.
Arthur.
Go to your family.
Arthur!
Get the hell out of here and be a goddamn man.
By now, he has finally understood what Arthur has been doing.
You're my brother.
I know. I know.
And the understanding carries a grief that has nowhere to land except on the man standing in front of him, dying, ordering him to leave. Arthur stays behind. He faces what is coming. Micah, the Pinkertons, the collapse of the only world he has ever known. And he does it with a clarity he has never possessed before, because the clarity is the disease's final gift. The man who spent 20 years unable to see past Dutch's mythology now sees everything.
All there is, winning and losing. Oh, Black Lung, you ain't gonna reach that gun. You ain't. You lost, my sick friend. You lost. In the end, Morgan, despite my best efforts to the contrary, it turns out I've won. God damn you.
It is over. Now, Arthur. It's over.
Oh, Dutch. He's right. You know it, and I know it. He's sick. He's dying. He's talking crazy. I gave you all I had. I did. Come on, Dutch. Let's go, buddy. We made it. We won. Come on. John made it. He's the only one. The rest of us... But I tried. In the end, I did. Come on. Let's go. We can make it. Come on, Dutch. Come on!
The sunrise that closes his story is not a reward. It is a timestamp. The light falls on a man whose body has finally stopped, on a mountain that will not carry his name. He dies free, which is the one thing he was told he had always been and never was until the last hours, when freedom stopped being a word Dutch sold him and became a choice Arthur made with the only currency he had left. The romantic myth of the outlaw dies harder than the outlaw himself. The culture that produced the myth needs it, needs the idea that somewhere, outside the structure, a man can live on his own terms. The reality underneath the myth is less comfortable and more human. Most lives are not chosen from scratch. The family that forms a person before they can question it, the beliefs absorbed before they are old enough to resist them, the loyalties that feel like identity because they were installed before identity had a chance to form independently, these arrive as conditions, not decisions. And the distance between recognizing that a condition is not a choice and actually doing something about the recognition is, for most people, measured not in moments of courage, but in decades of silence. Arthur Morgan was given a self at 14 by a man who needed soldiers. He wore that self for 20 years. He killed in it, loved in it, built every relationship he ever had inside its walls. And when the walls came down, when the man who built them was exposed and the body that carried them began to fail, what was left was a journal full of drawings of deer and sunsets, and 2 words spoken to a nun at a train station. The man underneath the myth had been there the entire time, sketching quietly, waiting for the collapse that would finally let him speak. He spoke too late to save himself. He spoke early enough to save someone else. And the sunrise did not care which one he was. The outlaw, the enforcer, the son who never had a father, or the man who drew the deer. It just arrived, the way it does, indifferent and warm, on a mountain where a body that had spent a lifetime belonging to someone else finally belonged to no one at all.